But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. I'll be talking to you guys today about the characteristics that we've been looking at related to the GLM, the Geostationary Lightning Mapper, and its characteristics related to severe storms across mainly the United States region. Now, before beginning, I do have a few acknowledgements. Of course, no good work is done alone. And so I would like to thank my advisors, Dr. Kristen Calhoun, Anthony Reinhardt, and Don McGorman for their hard work and contributions to this study along the way. They've been an excellent source of guidance and have really helped to shape this work to take it from what could be good to absolutely great. I also want to thank my SOM committee members, Dr. Cameron Homemeyer and Michael Biggerstaff, along with the University of Oklahoma's School of Meteorology and SIMS, NOAA and NOAA's NSSL, and then also the GOZAR reduction program for sponsoring this work. And when I arrived here 2 years ago, as Kristen had said in the intro, I was brought here really with the purpose. It was just after the Geostationary Lightning Mapper had launched. And so the broad goal of what I was brought here for was to study the GLM, its data, and to understand how it can work and be applied for the severe storms and operational research communities. So to go a background on the GLM itself, the GLM is a space-based optical sensor that covers a wide variety or a wide portion of the Western Hemisphere, detecting total lightning across both of its scenes on both GOES 16 here on the right-hand side and on GOES 17 in the left-hand, the thin black outline figure here. The Geostationary Lightning Mapper has a resolution of about 8 kilometers at the satellite subpoint, and then about 14 kilometers near the edge of the field of view. Across the CONUS region, that's about 9 to 11 kilometers, so it averages about 10. Now, the Geostationary Lightning Mapper isn't exactly detecting lightning itself, it's detecting events that are contributed to the lightning. And so those individual events are rapid changes in the optical brightness of the flashes that are emitted from cloud top. So the individual events, you can imagine as with this figure here at the bottom from Goodman et al. 2013, the individual boxes there are characterized as the events. Those events that are spatially near each other in the same 2 millisecond frame are then grouped together. And then those groups are then spatially and temporally clustered into flashes. And so this creates this kind of three levels of data within the GLM. But the GLM is only focused on the individual events that make up the flashes and those more physical characteristics. Now, the GLM, you can very easily plot the data that comes from the lightning cluster filter algorithm. But the question we could ask is, well, how do we make that more useful operationally? Looking here on the right, you can right away tell that this is quite easy to plot. They're just singular points in space. But what is this data really telling us? Especially like the cluster we see off to the western side, this region over here. It's much harder to get at what is lightning actually telling us about our storms and our convection in this area. And this figure is from Running et al. 2019. And there's another figure right after this that I'll show that really exploits this. But what I wanted to really get at is, well, how do we make this data more useful operationally? And one way that this has been done and has been implemented into the National Weather Service is through an open source Pythonic software package called GLM Tools. GLM Tools takes those relationships between our events, our groups, and our flashes, and then rebuilds those or rebuilds the spatial footprints of those flashes from the individual events. Those are then remapped onto the ABI grids, adjusting for the initial parallax correction, and then oversampled to 2 kilometers with 1 minute composites. And because we're able to rebuild the spatial footprint of these flashes into a unique grid, you can get a variety of products from these that you wouldn't be able to get just by looking at the individual flashes themselves. So some key gridded products you'll be seeing are flash extent density, which is the number of flashes that propagate through a given grid point over the 1 minute composite time period. The average and minimum flash areas, which are the average or minimum counts from the total number of flashes that have propagated through that individual cell. Then also there's the total optical energy, which you can see here. And comparing back and forth between these two figures, we can see these are from the same time periods, and this is how the optical energy fills out in just the summation of the energy that's emitted from those lightning flashes over that 1 minute period. And so we can take the initial flashes and then rebuild those and create a more spatial context and awareness to our data overall. And then lastly, there's the event density, which is just the summation of all the events and the counts of those events across all of the grid cells. To really drive home this point, this is another kind of case of comparing what you maybe would see with other ground-based sources versus the GLM gridded products. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see the NLDN and the Earth Network's Total Lightning Network. These two ground-based networks, you can see flashes that are more, there's more flashes off to the west, especially more in-cloud flashes from Earth Networks. When looking at the middle screen, this is the Oklahoma Lightning Mapping Array. And we again see a greater number of sources from that high-resolution mapping array off to the west with larger flashes extending out to the east. When looking at, on the far right panel, panel A, from the flash extent density, 1 minute of that data, we can see the higher flash rates that occur off to the west there. And we also can see in panel B, the larger flash areas that occur off to the west and then smaller ones, or I'm sorry, larger flash areas to the east and smaller ones to the west. And so this can give us additional spatial context of physical lightning characteristics themselves, which can be very important within the severe or within convection. Now, so far, the GLM was designed with a detection efficiency greater than 70% and a false alarm rate of less than 5%. And so far, this seems to be holding true as was designed. So there's a study that was from Bateman and Mott 2020 that compared the GLM against other ground-based networks and generally found across the entire field of view was above 70%. But there is some variations that we can see across the CONUS region, especially. So as we trend from the southeast and further away from the sensor into the Mountain West and the West Coast, we can see drop-offs or decreases in the detection efficiency fractions from the study. Murphy and Said also 2020 also backed this up and have stated that about 2,000 kilometers near the edge of the field of view is where you begin to see decreases in your detection efficiency from the GLM. And that's very much coincides with that region of lower detection efficiencies there in the top panel. And when looking at the false alarm rates, those are fairly similar as well. It does meet the mark, though there are some areas that could have improvement. You can see east of Florida and then into the Bahamas, there is a certain bar off there to the east, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But there are certainly areas that the GLM isn't perfect, but it is capturing what it was designed to do. Now, one of the hard things for our type of study, if we want to validate the GLM gridded products, is there really is no other GLM-like sensor that we can directly compare against for any type of longer-term bulk study. So the question we had to overcome right away was, well, can we use another type of observing system to evaluate our GLM gridded imagery? And well, we first asked, well, what about the advanced baseline imager? From the original picture up there on the top right of the satellite, you can see the GLM, but right next to it is the advanced baseline imager. It's a 16 band spectral radiometer. It's got from visible to the infrared wavelengths, resolutions from 0.5 to 2 kilometers, updates for the CONUS in the mode 6 superflex at every 5 minutes. And there are lots and lots of derived products, over 50 that you can gather from the information from these bands. The key point, though, that really makes this work for us is that the GLM imagery is on very much the same grid as many of the ABI products, making it adaptable and easy to make comparisons between the ABI and the GLM. So if we can look at characteristics of convection from the ABI and look at changes in the GLM, can we actually confirm and validate the data that we're actually observing from the sensor? So the broad research question that we came to is, can we use data from the ABI to validate our GLM gridded imagery? And more specifically, are there spatial variations of the ABI and GLM data to consider? Do we see decreased detection efficiencies, and do we see variations in the physical data itself when looking at it spatially? Secondly, do the GLM variables respond appropriately? And I have appropriately italicized because I'll explain more of that a little bit later. But in cases of varying convective intensity observed by the ABI, and then also when the GLM would be most needed, which is for forecasters with respect to severe convective phenomena, such as hail, tornadoes, and damaging winds. So we then set out and we wanted to build a combined ABI and GLM dataset in order to test our GLM variables. We decided to stick with two GLM gridded products, the flash extent density and the minimum flash area. We then used two ABI level 2 products. We used the cloud top height from the cloud top height algorithm. Now, this was selected in order to give a geospatial reference to our data and show, well, where are the flashes actually being emitted from in our data. Cloud top brightness temperatures from band number 13 were then used. That's the 10.3 micrometer or millimeter micrometer band in the infrared. That was used as a reference to the convective intensity, rates of glaciation that you can use. It is a little bit shorter than your legacy infrared bands that you would see on other previous GOES products, but it does provide a more accurate view, so the temperatures are a little bit warmer, but it can provide a more accurate view because it doesn't account for the absorption of your ozone and also water vapor within the lower stratosphere. In order to match our grids together, we then used 5-minute composites of our GLM data and bin them every 5 minutes to compare directly against from one ABI level 2 product to a GLM product. And then created a selective sampling method in order to back out our resolution of our data from 2 kilometers for our FED, our MFA, those are the flash extent density and the minimum flash area, and also the cloud top brightness temperature, and then the 10 kilometers from the cloud top height out to a 20-kilometer resolution. This was done in order to make direct comparisons between our data sets, and also because any type of spatial errors within our ABI or GLM data would be observed, and so we wanted to give some kind of leeway for our data set, but still be representative of the overall storm scale. So when backing out our resolution to 20 kilometers, we selected the maximum or minimum value, depending on what variable, within the 20-kilometer grid box. So we selected the maximum flash extent density and cloud top height value, along with the minimum flash area and cloud top brightness temperature values. And this was ran across the entire CONUS domain. One last thing, as we began to create these type of data sets, we began to notice some very anomalous data within our overall data sets and our distributions. We began seeing lots of false GLM events, and so this can be likened to what we found was related to Bateman and Mott 2020. There you can see that bar across the east of Florida with the increased false alarm rates. This also was observed in Rodlowski et al. 2018, initial observations of the Geostationary Lightning Mapper data. And this is due in part to the GLM subarrays themselves and the boundaries between them and their own sensitivities, but then also ocean wind. And so those rapid changes in the brightness off of the oceans could be enough to trigger individual events and small flashes that are not actually physical. It's just off of the Earth. So what we decided to do was create an ABI GLM filter with the thresholds you can see there. So if we had any kind of source that was, or any kind of data point that had a flash extent density that was greater than 10 flashes per 5 minutes, but had very warm and very low cloud top temperatures and heights, we deemed that those were not realistic from what you would expect to see in those cases, and those were removed from our data set. So when comparing everything together, this is our entire data set. We selected 7 weeks of data from the 13th of April to the 31st of May in 2019. This period coincided with multiple severe outbreaks across the central and eastern United States, along with a variety of modes of convection as well. We collected over 4.6 million samples that contain both ABI and GLM data. And then as we'll use later, we also selected randomly selected 2 million samples of data points that contained ABI data but did not have GLM data. And so when looking at this total data set, we can see those the regional hotspots there, especially across the central and southern plains of the United States. That's very much as you would expect. We also see more localized areas across Central America, and then also into Cuba and and also into the Caribbean as well. So we can see a really good mix of the scale of our convection across these areas and across basically the entire field of view. This is all fairly realistic as well when looking at our time density plot there at the bottom. And so we can see that most of our points are occurring during the late afternoon hours from 20 UTC until about 0 to 1 UTC, which would coincide with your most often observed convection, and then decreasing overnight until sunrise there around 13, 14, 15 UTC, and the minima we have in convective activity. So the first question we asked was, well, we built this filter, how did that filter perform? And generally, not bad. Well, when looking at our counts, we can see a lot of those points are confined to that bar east of Florida there into the Bahamas. And so that would appear spatially that we're picking up lots of ocean glint or even other GLM location errors that we can see potentially across the United States and across the CONUS domain. We can tell that many of these are due to ocean glint cases also by looking at our time density, and that those are maximized between about 16 UTC and 20 UTC. This very much aligns with when the sun would be passing directly overhead of the sensor in those regions, and therefore maximize the reflectance of the sunlight off of the ocean in order to create those ocean glint false events. So we already kind of out of the box, we're able to use the ABI and GLM data to help our own data set itself in order to improve our study. But getting back to our resource questions, first of all, looking at the spatial variations of our ABI and GLM data. We decided to approach our spatial question by looking at it as a function of viewing angle. And so we can look at it, or we calculated the viewing angle elevations using a spherical Earth approximation across the entire CONUS domain, and then took all of our data points and binned them every 10 degrees. And we'll compare the distributions of those points now in the following slides. So we'll first start out by looking at violin plots, comparing our cloud top height data with our various elevation bins, but then also by looking at our flash locations where, so the blue violins are the points where flashes did occur and also had ABI data, and then the green point or the green distributions are where ABI data was recorded, but there was no GLM data. So there are non-flash locations. And so when looking at our cloud top heights that do produce flashes, we can see that those are mainly spread across or roughly between 10 kilometers and 13 kilometers, with our median values usually centered around 12 kilometers or so, maybe around 12.5 kilometers. We can also see a decrease in our cloud top height distributions as we move to viewing angles less than 40 degrees. So those 20 to 30 and 30 to 40 degree bins, we can see slight decreases in those elevations there at the edges, near the edges of the field of view. Now there is notable differences between the cloud tops that did produce flashes and those that did not contain flashes. But really our distribution actually tends to almost have increasing overlap as we move to the increasing viewing angle elevations there on the right-hand side of the plot. And so what we can observe from there is, and actually near the ends, the peaks of the distributions where the highest densities occur are actually higher than the peak distributions on the flash locations there at the end. And so what is actually causing this? Well, if we go back to the previous slide, what we can observe is that at about 50 degrees in our viewing angles, we have a dramatic shift from mostly land points to points that are over the ocean. And so what we see, and this is actually has been confirmed with other satellite studies looking at cloud top height distributions, is that we have that clustering at the below about 4 kilometers and then above about 8 kilometers as well, is that those are mostly attributed to boundary layer cumulus clouds and also upper level cirrus clouds within the study. So with the cloud top heights, we can use those somewhat, and they can be a good a kind of discriminator between the cloud tops that do produce lightning versus those that don't. But other features, especially such as the cirrus clouds, is what we see within the tropics. Those can have certain issues that carry with them and make it more difficult to discern one from the other. Now with cloud top brightness temperatures, that is a slightly different story, especially when looking at viewing angles that are greater than 50 degrees. We can also see that most cloud top heights, or most of our cloud top temperatures, are around or are centered around about 220 degrees Kelvin, the medians of those distributions. And we can generally see then a downward shift between about 30 and 60 degrees Kelvin with our non-flash locations of increases. I do also note from the left-hand side of our plot is that the y-axis is inverted in this case, so that colder is up in this case, more kind of physically representative of what you would expect in the atmosphere. Now, when comparing our distributions, we can really almost draw a line directly across our plot from the cloud top brightness temperatures that are associated with GLM data and those that are not, right at around 240 degrees Kelvin. And so we can, by having this large shift in our overall distributions, this is a very clear signal to us that it isn't just important that we have mixed phase or a mixed phase cloud top and we're able to have any kind of rates of glaciations, is that we commonly need appreciable rates of glaciation and chart separation that is able to occur within a strong enough updraft in order to produce convection. So really that 240 Kelvin line shows a very large shift in our overall data sets. So from this initial section, we can walk away with two conclusions. First one is that areas with cloud tops that are colder than 240 typically do produce lightning, and that our GO16 viewing angle to convective features does complicate the interpretation of the ABI data, especially so with our cloud top height, and it is important to be considering if looked at with respect to lightning production. Moving on to our next research question, do the GLM variables respond appropriately then in the cases of the varying convective intensity? In order to kind of start out broadly, we'll look at the ABI and GLM relationships in a bulk sense. And so on the right here, this is a 2D histogram showing all 4.6 million points in our data set. And those are binned every 200 meters in cloud top height from the y-axis, and then cloud top temperature there on the x-axis. And when we put these together into the histogram, we definitely can see the varied distribution here. A lot of our higher density regions are less than 240 degrees or 240 Kelvin, which lines up with our violin plots from before. We can also see that the maximum densities, the most common areas the most common heights and temperatures where flashes were observed are associated with cloud tops that are around about 12 kilometers and cloud top temperatures, brightness temperatures, around 215 Kelvin. We also see the central axis that sets up along the data, noted with the black box here. And we see this inverse relationship between our cloud top height and temperature, which is also physically realistic within that zone. And that zone actually roughly approximates out to the moist adiabatic lapse rate, which was a very good kind of affirmation that this is what we should be seeing. But we have cloud tops that go up to even 18 kilometers or so, but we have a very wide variety of heights and temperatures across this entire spectrum. So it's great that we can look at, well, where our flashes are occurring in those areas on this type of spectrum, but how do our GLM gridded variables themselves change when we move around in this space? So as we move from lower or warmer cloud top temperatures to higher and colder temperatures, which should be indicative of stronger updrafts and stronger convection, how does the GLM data actually vary? And so initially, if you were at my seminar talk, you might have seen the three-dimensional scatter plots, which use the size of the dots related to the GLM variables themselves. But with 4.6 million data points, we couldn't, of course, show all of the points at once, and it was really hard to, at times, to show those more specific relationships. And so what we devised after that was assessing based upon median contour plots. These are binned in the same fashion as the 2D histograms, as we see in this figure here on the right, with the 200 meters and 1 degree Kelvin. But the median value is sampled from each two-dimensional bin. And then all bins greater than 100 here are shown with the figure on the right. So this is looking at the median FED value within each bin as a function of the cloud top temperature and height. When assessing this figure, what we can see is this clear shift that occurs with the very low FED values. They're between about 240 and 260 Kelvin. And then shifting upward, we have increasing FED values greater than 10, then roughly above about 200 or below 200 Kelvin and above 15 kilometers to our maximum values there well above 30 at those highest regions. Those highest regions are representative of fairly small sample sizes overall, but what this tells us is that in the cases when when the ABI is observing these types of strong values within convection, that the GLM is more likely to observe these higher flash density values in this area. This was also repeated for the 25th and 75th percentile, and this type of distribution in the increase that we see here was strikingly similar. When we repeat this now for the minimum flash area, that comes out almost the opposite direction, where we have larger flash areas that are observed, or larger minimum flash areas that are observed within our lower and warmer cloud tops, and then shift to smaller minimum flash areas related to our higher and colder cloud top regions. And so when we look at both of these, kind of looking at a back and forth method, we can see this inverse relationship that sets up between our FED and our MFA. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why is this important? And is this something that you actually should be observing in your data set? And the answer for that is yes. And it boils down to the importance of your flash rate versus your flash size. It's been shown in numerous studies when comparing against the size of the flashes and those physical characteristics spatially that we do see variations in our flash rate and sizes. And much of that is due to the regions of charge which allow those flashes to propagate. This figure from Bunning and McGorman 2013 in the middle of the screen is a really great example that can help piece these together. In panel B here, you can imagine that this is regions of charge you would expect close to an updraft. That's highly turbulent, lots of mixing, turning over, differential velocities, vertical velocities, and you have these smaller compact regions of charge, which means you have lots of interactions between oppositely charged regions that are able to generate flashes. But because those flash regions are very small, that means that they that the flash areas you would see would be smaller, but you would have lots of flashes. Conversely, in more stratified regions of charge, such as in panel A, there would be less, or it takes longer to build up the amount of charge in order to have the electrical breakdown and to initiate flashes, but you would have larger flashes in those areas. So we have, again, that inverse relationship between the local flash rate and also the size of the flashes within that area. And that's been observed in numerous, observed in model studies and model studies. There on the left, there are some references to more recent ones that have been done, but there are other ones even going back to before 2000s of observing this relationship as well. Now, and the key thing with our study is that in this study, as we have increasing convective intensity with the increasing heights and temperatures, we see increasing FED and decreasing MFA in those regions. So this is physically consistent with what one would expect. Now, of course, I can't sell you fully on this as it is a perfect relationship. There are some limitations within the GLM sensor that we did end up uncovering. Some of that is variations in your GLM flash size. This figure here on the right is from a sub-study that I had done earlier, looking at diurnal variations in the maximum GLM flash size over 2019. And that was sampling all of the largest GLM flashes every 10 minutes across the entire year, and then creating a diurnal distribution of those points. And we can see a marked shift from the overnight hours between about 22 UTC to about 12 UTC, and then in between those periods, decreasing maximum flash sizes. And so some of this could be optical effects upon the sensor, but it also could be the upscale growth in convection that you would see as well. So the exact contribution of the GLM sensor and its limitations, or just the meteorology, is slightly unknown as to how this shift works. But this shift has been observed by others as well. We also note that large GLM flashes, especially if you look at the maximum values of our diurnal variations, there is a consistent and hard marker right above 10,000 square kilometers. And at those regions, the GLM flashes are truncated down to those values. There's also maximum number of groups and events that can make up a flash because this algorithm is running operationally in real time. Peterson 2019 has some great examples of this. This is a flash here that was actually split into 33 separate flashes in the GLM's eyes, but when reclustered, without any type of limitations on your groups and events, that they were all put into one singular flash. Also, with the clustering algorithm itself, that algorithm is fairly stable, and the variations in the clustering methods have small variations, especially with lower flash rates. But when you have storms that have higher flash rates, greater than 40 flashes per minute, it was shown within Murphy and said that also can have, Murphy and said 2020, excuse me, that there can be variations with how those more complex flashes can be clustered at those smaller scales. But even with that, we are still able to pull out this relationship. So we can add to our conclusions that with the increasing local flash density, this correlates with decreasing flash areas and then higher cloud top heights and colder cloud top temperatures. So as we have more intense convection, we see physical relationships from the GLM that one would expect. Moving on to our last research question, which is related to severe convective phenomena. Now isolating our GLM and ABI variables, excuse me, with respect to hail, tornadoes, and damaging winds. We're going to do this, though, by examining our data set with proximity to local storm reports. Now, local storm reports do have lots of caveats associated with them. These are recorded by people, so there's not just human error. There's also lots of clustering that can occur in higher population areas based on road networks and other features as well. So we tried to mitigate those as much as possible when flagging the data that was near LSRs in our data set. And so on the right-hand side, we can see, with that figure, we can see all over 9,500 LSRs that were included within our data set. And what we did was, when an LSR occurred, we flagged the nearest 9 points to our ABI and GLM, the 20-kilometer grid, which creates about a 30-kilometer zone of sampling data around that point. We also then used a 10-minute window around the LSR, and by trying to use those 9 points, we tried to also mitigate any type of parallax correction between the ground-based reports and the observations from cloud top that one would expect in those areas. Now, of course, these LSRs aren't capturing all types of weather, all types of severe reports, especially those that would be the severe weather that would occur outside of the US domain. But what we want to show is what happens when we are sampling from those storms that are producing severe weather. And when observing our relationships, again, going back to our 2D histograms there, we can see an upward shift to higher and colder cloud tops within that maximum region, or that maximum density area, now just above 200 Kelvin and at about 14 kilometers. That central axis, though, has still set up in that region where we have the inverse relationship between cloud top temperature and height. But we do note a secondary axis that has set up there above about 15 kilometers, where we see fairly nominal decreases in our cloud top temperature, but see rapid increases in our cloud top heights. And I'll come back to that section later. But generally, with this upward shift in our distribution, we are sampling from a higher intensity of thunderstorms as compared to our overall data set. And we do know that this data set now from those 9,000 LSRs, we're now down to 61,000 ABI and GLM points there. So now asking the questions again, how the GLM variables respond in this type of space. And the answer is even stronger than what we saw before. When looking at our median contour plots, we can very clearly see a shift from our lower and warmer cloud tops. And if the FED values are lower in these cases, FED counts are reduced. We then see increased FED as we go to higher cloud top heights and lower cloud top temperatures with increasing intensity in that zone. We also do note that the minimum sample size in this case has been reduced to 10 in order to give us a larger spectrum. If we'd only done 100, it would have been a very small section due to our smaller sample size in this case. When observing the minimum flash area, we have the opposite relationship again set up even stronger with a larger zone that we see with the smallest available minimum flash areas at those higher and colder cloud tops. And so by looking at these relationships, really we can get that with severe storms, we really are seeing this even more than ever. Now, in case you weren't convinced yet, maybe you looked at all this data and you thought, well, it's great that we can look at this in bulk, but what do the actual storms look like? What are we actually observing? So to kind of really nail this point home, we'll be looking at a case study from 24 May 2019 of a supercell across south central Kansas. Produced a variety of severe weather reports, had a consistent life cycle, a longer life cycle we can actually examine, and we'll be looking at that data overall. So that supercell did initialize there in the red circle, or did initiate around 20 UTC. We pick up a little bit later in the action around 2040 UTC, and this is looking at the MRMS Rala product. And so we have this region of high reflectivity, greater than about 50 dBz in this region, and we have we have a very consistent updraft, one of the stronger ones within the area as storms initiate along that boundary that we can see there, oriented from the northeast to the southwest. When we look at the GLM data at this time period, we can see the inverse relationship again between FED and our MFA. So on the left-hand side, we can see the higher FED counts within those zones correlated with the lower minimum flash areas. And we can also then see off to the east of that red circle, we can see the lower FED counts, but with higher minimum flash areas in that zone. And so we already can see that kind of relationship setting up. The FED counts also show that this is one of the kind of hotspots as well when looking at the convective intensity in comparison to other storms within the region. When looking at the ABI data, we can see with our cloud top brightness temperatures there on the left, we can see cloud top temperatures that are less than about 210 Kelvin in that region there, developing updraft, consistently producing lightning, and then also cloud top heights that are now bumping up against the tropopause there above about 14 kilometers. And so as we have those zones do correlate quite well back and forth with the relationships that we did observe in those from our previous plots. We also did observe around 2110 a very interesting feature that was a very pronounced overshooting top feature with some of the highest cloud top heights that we observed in the study, especially related to LSRs. And we had a maximum cloud top height of the feature around 17 kilometers there at the bottom right, and brightness temperatures that were below 200 Kelvin in that region. Now on the left-hand side there, that's the 2D histogram that's came back from before, but that star though plots that point of the overshooting top on that data. And when sampling other points within that secondary axis, we observed that those were also related to overshooting convectives or overshooting convection above the tropopause in those areas. And so it was really great, or really cool, honestly, to be seeing that type of data, but it also even drives home the point further that we are sampling from a stronger population of convection as compared to the entire data set. Now, shortly afterwards, we'll see that this supercell went on to produce severe reports around 2120 UTC, but we'll play it out from 2100 to 2200. And this will run through a few times, but what we can see is that consistently that supercells or the LSRs within that area correlate with the supercell. And in those higher FED regions, we also see the smaller MFA definitely within that zone as this plays out over the next hour, producing a variety of severe weather reports from those individual LSRs. The red dots are the tornadoes, the wind, the blue are the wind reports, and the greens are the hail reports there. If we examine this supercell across its entire life cycle, sampling the maximum FED, the minimum MFA, along with the minimum brightness temperature and the maximum cloud top heights, we can again see this type of relationship play out that is physically realistic. And so we have the decrease, we have consistently the increase in the FED values and increasing heights earlier on in the storm, and then have decreasing MFA and decreasing brightness temperatures leading up to our overshooting top feature at about 2110 UTC, with our first reports, our first LSR being recorded at 2119 UTC. And so we can see that as the storm evolves and as the updraft becomes more intense, that the minimum flash area continues to decrease as we have increasing rates of glaciation there, as related to the cloud top brightness temperatures, and that this can that what we are observing is physically realistic. So wrapping this all up, our overarching conclusion is that while there's a lot of text there, but that more informally is that we can combine the ABI and GLM data in order to help study convection, and that the GLM is operating as you would expect within those cases of varying intensity by the ABI. More specifically, from our original conclusions, that areas with cloud tops that are colder than 240 typically do produce lightning. That the GHOST 16 viewing angle to convective features does complicate the interpretation of the data, especially with cloud top height, and should be considered when using in future studies, and that the increasing local flash density does correlate with the decreasing areas, higher cloud top heights, and colder cloud top temperatures. And this is especially true in cases of severe convection. So it was great that we were able to merge the ABI and GLM in these data sets, but hopefully in the future, these can even be done with other data sets too, or other gridded data sets, even from ground-based networks and other observing platforms too. So when looking at our sources of GLM data, in case you would want to refer to those, you can get those through NOAA Class, the GHOST 16 Data Archive at the website listed there, also from Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services. If you would even like to generate the gridded products that you saw in this presentation, those can be found through GitHub and through GLM Tools there. And I do want to acknowledge and say thank you also to Dr. Eric Brunning from Texas Tech for not just the development of GLM tools, but then also to help us kind of get going and set up on that as a presentation. So lastly, finishing up here, the sources of everything that I cited through today and all those features. And I want to thank everybody for attending this virtual thesis presentation, and hopefully looking forward to, actually I'm excited to also announce that a manuscript that was a portion of this work was accepted into the American Geophysical Union's Journal of Geophysical Research, the Atmosphere section, under a very similar title as the presentation. So be on the lookout for that, hopefully in the coming month or so. But we're really excited to put out this type of work and see what the rest of the community is able to do with merged data sets and other data sets when looking at the GLM.